Fine. Gordon, the word is yours. Go ahead.
All right, very good. Thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen here. And do me a favor, just confirm you can see the presentation.
Yes.
Okay, great. And I think I have 15 minutes, correct?
Yes.
So I will move kind of fast. So the topic of this presentation is Money Laundering 2020, though it's kind of scary to think that 2020 is halfway done. COVID makes time fly. And specifically, we're going to talk about AMLD5 and the FATF recommendations, and I'll explain what that means in a moment. Also, if anyone in the audience would like a copy of this presentation, you can add me on, actually, you know what, I'll put it right here. You can add me on LinkedIn or on Telegram, and I'm happy to send it to you. Again, the name is Gordon Einstein, and if you want to add me on LinkedIn, it's just at Gordon Einstein right there. So just because of the time constraints, I'll skip all the usual stuff, but basically, I have to tell you all, I'm not your lawyer and don't commit crime, in case anyone was wondering. Okay, so again, I'm going to move fast through this presentation, and Sergey, give me kind of like a few minute warning, just because I don't have a time up on the screen, if you don't mind.
I can't do it now, but you have 15 minutes. It's okay. I will let you know, yes, when we end of the time.
Just let me know when it happens. Okay. Yeah. So there's three things worth talking about, or I'm going to quickly go through, I should say. There's the general idea of money laundering as it used to be, the world before crypto, which feels like a long time ago. Then there's sort of what crypto has done to that concept of money laundering. And then there's what are the regulators doing in response to the situation that's been caused by crypto. So what did money laundering used to be? How did crypto affect it? And how are the regulators reacting to it? So let's look at the traditional definition of money laundering, because it really is sort of a technical definition. So the idea is it's the conversion process whereby the illicit proceeds, and that's a key term, of criminal activity lose their association with that criminal activity and then become usable wealth, in the sense that that money is usable by the bad guys. So all these highlighted statements, I guess you could say, or phrases, I'm going to address these out of order. And again, a preview of the end is that because of crypto and the regulators' responses to crypto, this traditional definition has really morphed or changed almost beyond recognition. So again, conversion process whereby illicit proceeds of criminal activity lose their association with that criminal activity and thus become usable wealth. So what does that actually mean? Well, it used to be that you could not have money laundering unless there was a crime, right? Because the whole idea of money laundering is that you have the proceeds or the money or the resources or the wealth that were generated as a result of engaging in criminal activity. So if you're selling drugs, or if you're selling stolen goods for money or something else, the money that you get for those drugs, or the money you get from the sale of stolen goods, because selling stolen goods is a crime, and because drug dealing is a crime, the proceeds of that were deemed to be illicit. That's the complete term, or that's a relevant term. And the crime that led to the creation of those proceeds was known as the predicate crime. So in the absence of a predicate crime, you could not have illicit proceeds. Therefore, the concept of money laundering didn't straight out apply. Now, this is sort of an old-fashioned, almost, if you like, definition of money laundering. For better or for worse, it's not quite that strict anymore. So it's a lot easier to launder money than it used to be, even if you're doing it by mistake. I also want to point out for your audience that keep in mind that when something is illegal, that doesn't necessarily make it criminal, though it can be. There's something illegal from a regulatory point of view, and there's something illegal from a criminal point of view. And sometimes things are both. There's sort of a regulatory violation of money laundering rules, but then there's a criminal violation. Just like there's a regulatory violation of securities laws, but there can also be a criminal violation, and one does not preclude the other. So when looking at all these rules, including money laundering, you have to say what's legal from a regulatory point of view, and then what's legal or what's illegal from a criminal law point of view. So again, that was traditional money laundering. So this traditional definition of money laundering, even before the advent of crypto, this definition was getting expanded over time. And the initial expansion of this definition of just the idea of a predicate crime leading to illicit proceeds was sort of a geopolitical expansion, for lack of a better term. Money laundering and anti-money laundering really kicked into high gear globally, but specifically in the United States, following the terrorist attacks on September 11, 2001, which actually 20 years ago almost at this point. What the US government did is they turned the focus not just on the terrorist activity, but on how these terrorists got funded. How did they get trained? Who paid for their training? And the US, for the first time extremely seriously, I would say, took what were the money laundering rules and decided to apply it to a new category, which is counter-terrorist financing, CTF. So, of course, terrorism is a crime, but now they're going beyond traditional sort of financial crimes or crimes with the intent of making money to terrorist-related crimes also. So that expanded the definition of money laundering. Also, another geopolitical expansion of the definition is money laundering rules are now deemed to apply to transactions by countries or states that are hostile to the United States or hostile to certain major powers. So, for example, Iran or North Korea, it's usually countries that are going for a nuclear capacity, but not just them. You can think of Venezuela, for example. When there's financial transactions that violate US or global sanctions, a anti-money laundering type regime has been applied to those transactions as well. And then finally, tax avoidance and tax evasion are sometimes criminal and they're sometimes not. But there's been a tendency now towards criminalizing tax evasion and also applying money laundering rules to punish or track down tax evasion. That did not used to be a thing. But post 9/11 and post United States and other countries, say, for example, leaning on Switzerland and the UBS scandal and the Panama Papers scandal, there's been a shift to using the anti-money laundering rules against tax evasion also, even though there's not necessarily a crime involved, or even when the laundering the money is the crime rather than the results of the crime. So this is sort of the traditional model, layer one and layer two. Now, what's the point of anti-money laundering? What are we trying to accomplish? Well, the main idea is that the banking system, at least before crypto, was extremely useful. It was a way to keep your money safe. It was a way to operate at scale. It was a way to transfer funds between different parties who didn't trust each other, but you had a central bank or central group of banks that were trustworthy or had regulations in place so you could handle these kind of transactions. It's very hard on either a national or enterprise or personal scale to do anything large without access to the banking system. So anti-money laundering was, or just kind of, well, actually, let me take a step back. And so the anti-money laundering was traditionally focused on the banking system, and banking system defined broadly. So to include financial institutions, which are not just banks, but are companies that provide some sort of financial or money-based services. So if you look at how anti-money laundering was traditionally applied, it was sort of a, if you want to use a network model, a computer network model, it sort of inserted itself at the nodes of the system. It would insert itself into the banks. It would insert itself into the financial institutions. Anti-money laundering efforts would focus on the on-ramps and off-ramps from the financial system in order to monitor and hopefully deny the bad guys access to this wonderful system. Right. So again, on this slide, I'm kind of highlighting the banking system has functionality which we want to deny to the bad guys and the bad countries, and we also want to monitor what they're doing and make them not profit from what they're doing. So it's denial and it's also monitoring when anti-money laundering is successful. So if I'm a bad guy, if I'm a criminal, or if I'm trying to build nuclear weapons, what do I do if I can't use the banking system? Well, if you're Pakistan, you can set up your own bank. That was a bank of, I think it was BCCI, where they set up their own bank to facilitate their financial transactions that in support of their nuclear program. But if you're just a regular company or a regular mafia group, what do? if you can't access the bank? Well, that's the reason why cash has been so attractive to criminal activities for so long, because cash, when you hold on to it, is sort of a way of avoiding the banking system. And when you do physical transactions in cash or cash-like things like precious metals or real estate sometimes, or import receipts or trade receipts, these are cash or cash equivalents that let you take advantage of international money flows, but sometimes outside of the banking system. So physical cash has always been attractive to criminals, and anti-money laundering has always had a hard time going after physical cash because, there's an expression in the US that, cash has no smell. In other words, if enough people cash goes from the bad people to the good people, it's very hard to trace back to the original source. So even though money laundering rules were kind of weak against cash, governments had a few things going in their favor, which is, even though cash is great for criminals, it's hard to manage in bulk. It's hard to, have pallets full of cash and transfer those around. They're heavy, they're hard to secure, they attract attention. So a big thing, if I was the bad guys, was moving cash and all the difficulties that went along with that. So again, what's money laundering's ultimate goal? Most of the proceeds you get from criminal activity are cash. So the goal is to, again, from the first slide, to move the cash or the proceeds from the criminal activity through a different series of transactions so that they kind of lose the smell of the criminal activity, and you can take complete access or have complete access to the banking system and take advantage of what it offers, and to be able to hold on to it over time and not worry about the tax authorities and not worry about the government and not worry about other mafia groups getting their hands on it. So it's basically sort of losing the smell of the criminal source. And again, I'm moving fast and I'm happy to share this deck and talk about this more. So there's 3 phases of money laundering. If you want to learn how to launder money, this is the class for you. There's placement, there's layering, and there's integration. So placement is when you have the proceeds from illegal activity and you enter them into the financial system, ideally at some sort of weak point. And what's a weak point? Well, it's not a bank. Banks are very big on know your customer and anti-money laundering and all that stuff. It's like a pawn shop or an import-export business or someone who deals in precious metals or gift cards. That's sort of a weak point or an entry point into the financial system. And then by taking those funds that you put into the financial system and moving them around in a series of complex, hard to trace, multi-layer transactions, this is known as layering. And that's when you kind of begin to lose the smell of the criminal source of those funds. And then finally, integration is making those now laundered funds useful to you as the bad guy. So always think PLI. PLI is how you do money laundering. It's placement, it's layering, and it's integration. Okay, so what we just did is we went over the traditional definition of money laundering. We went over the expanded geopolitical / tax implication. We talked about why the banking system is good for the bad guys if they can get into it. We also talked about, because it's hard to get into it, the benefits of cash and also the difficulties with cash. And we just went over sort of the step-by-step process where traditionally people would take the proceeds of their illegal activity and get it into the financial system. Well, crypto has made this whole thing extremely difficult, and money laundering in 2020 is a whole different ball of wax. Okay, so here's a paradigm I just want to throw at the group. This is sort of my idea, which is the banking system. Yes, sir.
We have to go to the finish. 1 minute.
Okay, well, there you go. You know what? I'll just go to the end. Okay, here's what you need to think about in 2020. There's 2 key regulations. There's AMLD5, Anti-Money Laundering Directive 5. That's an EU directive that came out and is mandatory for all EU countries. Then there's the Financial Action Task Force recommendations. The FATF is a global body that only does recommendations, but they're global. And the big things to keep in mind is that AMLD5 applied or extended the typical financial institution responsibilities to crypto exchanges and to entities engaging in fiat to crypto and crypto to fiat transactions. So all those companies now need to know your customer and apply anti-money laundering. And it's mandatory. They have to do it. I'd also say it's an opportunity for some of those companies because now banks have maybe lost their excuse for not dealing with them, because since everyone has to do AML and KYC, there should be no issue dealing with crypto companies. I'm moving fast here. And the FATF recommendations are, again, they're just recommendations, but they're taken seriously and different companies are implementing them. Keep in mind that it's different from the AML Directive 5 recommendations, because these recommendations apply to crypto transactions, not just crypto to fiat and fiat to crypto transactions. Also, there's something called the funds travel rule, which is if funds are moving through a series of financial institutions, these recommendations, the FATF recommendations, require that every institution along that path know the complete path of those funds. So you got to keep two things in mind: the AMLD5 and the FATF. See what applies where, see what your business model is, and structure appropriately. So, Sergey, I moved fast. Am I doing okay with time?
Yeah, for sure. Gordon, a huge thanks to you for this greatest presentation. Yes, now we get to learn how money laundering works from regulation perspective. Yes, it's a good idea for us. Now we go off from the on air. Yeah, finally we stop the presentation. Thanks a lot. Thanks for joining us. Yes,
I wish I could join you in person and next time.
Yes, and on the next time. Yes, sorry, because we haven't so much time, but I think you have a lot of you explained a lot of your presentation. I think it's much more understandable for the audience.
And I'm happy to share the presentation. Okay, I'll let you go because I know you need to move on. Thank you. Talk to you soon.
Thanks a lot, Gordon. Nice to meet you here. See you.
Bye.